In 2022, the world's most beloved entertainer walked across a stage at the Academy Awards and proved he had been performing a lie for 44 years. Not a small lie, not a public relations adjustment, a fundamental construction, a man entirely built from the wreckage of a childhood wound, layer upon layer of calculated perfection, designed to bury a single moment of paralysis from 50 years prior. Millions watched Will Smith's hand connect with Chris Rock's face. They watched him return to his seat and scream. They watched him accept the Oscar for Best Actor minutes later, tears streaming, while the entire industry held its breath. What they saw was a breakdown. What it actually was, the fulfillment of a promise he'd made to himself at 9 years old. The moment he finally moved when his body demanded he protect someone. The tragedy was that it came too late, and too publicly, and destroyed almost everything he had spent 3 decades constructing to prove he wasn't the coward he believed himself to be. This is not a story about fame ruined by a single moment. This is a story about what happens when the armor you spend your whole life building finally cracks, and you discover that the man inside was never the problem. The man inside was always real. It's the man outside, the perfect one, the untouchable one, the one you invented. That one was the lie. Will Smith's entire existence has been a masterclass in self-construction. And at 58 years old, he's finally stopping. Before we go deeper into the man behind the image, I want to ask you to honor Will Smith's willingness to be broken in public by leaving a like on this video and subscribing. He spent 4 decades protecting us from his imperfection. The least we can do is acknowledge the courage it took for him to finally stop. The genesis of every performance is trauma. Not diagnosed trauma, not formally acknowledged. Just the weight of a moment so small in duration, but so absolute in consequence, that it reshapes a child's understanding of who he is required to be. It was 1977, Philadelphia, a row house on Willington Street. Inside, a 9-year-old boy named Willard Carroll Smith II heard his father, Willard Carroll Smith Sr., strike his mother, Caroline. The boy stood frozen. That is the core fact. He stood frozen, and in that paralysis, young Will Smith made a decision that would consume the rest of his life. He was a coward. He was not a protector. He was not a man. He was the opposite of what a man should be. And if he survived to adulthood, he would spend every single day proving this childhood verdict wrong. His father was a refrigeration engineer, a man of dignity and distance. Willard Sr. carried no warmth. He carried no softness. He was a blueprint for what manhood looked like in Philadelphia in the 1970s. Present, authoritative, untouched by feeling. His mother was the emotional infrastructure. She was Pentecostal, musical, alive in a way that stood in direct contrast to his father's severity. The boy loved both and learned nothing from either except this. Masculinity meant distance, and love meant pain that you absorbed without moving. When Willard Sr. left the family in 1988, the wound closed. It never healed. It calcified. The boy who stood frozen at 9 years old made an unconscious vow. He would become untouchable. He would become perfect. He would become so likable, so talented, so necessary to the world around him that no one could ever question whether he was a man. He would earn it. He would prove it. He would build a character so appealing, so magnetic, so fundamentally good that the cowardly boy underneath would be buried so deeply that even he might forget he existed. For the next 44 years, he did exactly that. In 1985, as a teenager, Will Smith co-founded DJ Jazzy Jeff with his childhood friend Jeffrey Towns. By 1986, they had released their first album. By 1987, they were superstars in a scene that was supposed to be everything his father wasn't: creative, expressive, unafraid of feeling. But even in hip-hop, Will Smith refused to be the real version. He was the clean version, the funny version, the one who rapped about his parents' divorce with a smile, the one who made you feel good in a medium built on truth-telling and rage. Parents Just Don't Understand became an anthem in 1989 precisely because it took pain and made it palatable. Millions of teenagers heard their own broken homes in that song and felt seen, but also safe, because Will Smith's version of heartbreak included a punchline. The armor was already working. He was already performing invincibility through comedy, already turning his wound into universal appeal. When his recording career stalled in 1990 due to royalty disputes and financial mismanagement, He owed nearly $2.8 million to the IRS and his label. A different man might have disappeared into the shame. Young Will Smith had made millionaire's mistakes at 19 years old and blown it. The coward's voice in his head was loud. Instead, he pivoted. By 1990, he was cast as Jeffrey Jazz Banks in The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, a show that would become the blueprint for his entire public identity. The show was a genius of self-construction. A poor kid from Philadelphia thrust into a mansion in California, an outsider trying to fit into wealth and whiteness, cracking jokes to deflect from his actual alienation. The audience loved him because he was playing an earnest version of himself, but he was playing. Every laugh was calculated. Every moment of vulnerability was written and rehearsed. The Fresh Prince was the armor perfected. For 6 seasons, from 1990 to 1996, Will Smith wasn't just a star. He became a cultural event. He was young, beautiful, funny, untouchable. He married his high school sweetheart Sherry Zampino in 1992 and fathered a son, Trey, that same year. To the world, this was the continuation of the clean-cut narrative. The good guy settling down, doing the right thing, building a family. What the world didn't see was a marriage that would fracture by 1995. A young man still running from the weight of that 9-year-old's paralysis, still unable to truly be present with anyone because presence meant vulnerability and vulnerability meant being the coward. By the time The Fresh Prince ended in 1996, Will Smith had already begun his transition into film. And this is where his self-construction reached its apotheosis. The films that followed The Fresh Prince were not accidents. They were architectural choices. Will Smith did not stumble into blockbuster stardom. He engineered it with the precision of someone who understood that visibility was protection. Every role was a careful calibration. Not too vulnerable, not too edgy. Always fundamentally likable. Always the hero. Always the one who saves the day. Bad Boys in 1995 established him as an action star. Independence Day in 1996 made him untouchable, a movie star, the kind of performer who could carry a global spectacle and make you root for him while aliens destroyed Los Angeles. He wasn't just famous anymore. He was transcendent. He was the Fresh Prince grown into a man the entire world believed in. Men in Black followed in 1997. Enemy of the State in 1998. Each film was a refinement of the same alchemy. Will Smith is the impossible combination of skill and charm, the man who could fight aliens or government conspiracies and still make you laugh, still make you believe he was fundamentally good. And then came 2001 and Ollie. Ollie was different. For the first time in his career, Will Smith was asked to play a man who was not invincible. Muhammad Ali was a man of ego and doubt, of religious conversion and doubt, of beauty and rage. The role required vulnerability. It required him to access something real underneath the armor. Critics noticed. The film was nominated for 2 Academy Awards. Will Smith was beginning to show cracks in the perfect facade, but they were controlled cracks, aesthetically approved cracks. The kind that made him look deeper, more serious, more like an actor rather than just a star. The Pursuit of Happiness in 2006 continued this trajectory. A father and son, homeless, struggling. Will Smith playing a man utterly broken by circumstance. Again, the Academy noticed. Again, the world saw his capacity for genuine emotion, but it was still controlled. It was still a performance of vulnerability within a narrative frame that allowed him to remain the hero. The public climax of his career came in full bloom between 2008 and 2015. 4 Bad Boys films, multiple blockbusters, a music career resurrected, awards and accolades, and the kind of global recognition that transcends entertainment. Will Smith became an idea. He became invincibility incarnate. He became the blueprint for how to be a black man in Hollywood and never be threatening, never be too political, never be anything other than welcome. This was the apotheosis of the armor. But underneath, where the world couldn't see, the cracks were deepening. Will Smith's first marriage to Sherry Zampino had ended in divorce by 1997. The failure was quiet, nearly invisible in the glare of his rising star. A son left in the distance. A young man still unable to be present, still running from the wound, still unable to trust that love wouldn't require him to be paralyzed again. His relationship with his father, Willard Sr., was a landscape of unresolved terrain. They maintained contact. They maintained civility. But the boy who had stood frozen, watching his father strike his mother, had never become a man who could forgive that act or the wound it left. When Willard Sr. died in 2016, Will Smith delivered a eulogy that was gracious and distant, the eulogy of a man who had spent 50 years proving his father wrong, and who still, even in death, could not allow himself to fully grieve. Then came Jada Pinkett Smith. They married in 1997, 2 years after his first marriage ended. Jada was an actress. She was intelligent, complicated, unwilling to play the supporting role of wife to Will Smith's empire. From the beginning, their marriage was unconventional. She was not content to be silent. She was not content to be secondary. She was a woman with her own ambitions, her own struggles, her own wounds. For years, they performed the perfect marriage for the world. They had 2 children together, Jaden in 1998 and Willow in 2000. They walked red carpets. They smiled in photographs. They became the gold standard of celebrity couples, beautiful, powerful, seemingly unbreakable. But by the early 2010s, the marriage was fracturing. The details emerged slowly. In 2016, Jada gave an interview suggesting they were in a separation. In 2020, she admitted on her talk show that she had engaged in an affair, which she called an entanglement, a word that would become a symbol of their marriage's complexity and pain. Will Smith heard about his wife's infidelity the way millions of others did, through media and public discussion. The man who had built his entire existence on the appearance of perfect control was being publicly humiliated by the one person he had allowed inside the armor. The marriage continued in a state of ambiguous limbo. They were together. They were not together. They presented as a couple. They acknowledged separation. Jada pursued her own healing journey publicly. Will Smith remained largely silent, still performing, still controlling the narrative, still unable to let the world see that he too was broken. On March 27, 2022, at the 94th Academy Awards, Will Smith was sitting in the audience as a nominated actor. His film King Richard was in contention. He was at the peak of his career once again. He had rebuilt himself multiple times. He had survived scandal and weathered criticism. He was 53 years old and still seemingly invincible. Chris Rock took the stage to present Best Documentary Feature. He made a joke about Jada Pinkett Smith's shaved head, comparing her to G.I. Jane. Jada has alopecia. She shaves her head by necessity, not choice. The joke was cruel. It was public. It was humiliating. In that moment, the 9-year-old boy who had stood frozen 54 years earlier finally moved. Will Smith rose from his seat. He walked onto the stage. He struck Chris Rock across the face. The entire world watched. The armor didn't just crack. It shattered. He returned to his seat. He screamed profanities. Security stood by, uncertain what to do. Minutes later, Will Smith won Best Actor for King Richard. He took the stage, tears streaming down his face, and delivered an acceptance speech that was both an apology and a justification. A man finally allowing the world to see that beneath the perfect exterior lived someone afraid, someone angry, someone capable of violence in defense of someone he loved. Love will make you do crazy things, he said. It was the truest sentence he had ever spoken in public. But the cost of that truth would consume everything that followed. The consequences arrived with the speed of a consequence that had been waiting decades to fall. Within hours, Will Smith had apologized to Chris Rock via social media. Within days, he had resigned from the Academy. Within weeks, the professional architecture he had spent 30 years constructing began to collapse. Sony shelved the fourth Bad Boys film indefinitely. Netflix canceled a major comedy special. A docuseries was shelved. The man who had been universally beloved became, for the first time in his adult life, genuinely toxic, not to the entire world, but to the institutions that had protected and promoted him. The slap had been public, but the exile was far more thorough and intimate. It was the kind of professional death that only happens to people famous enough to fall from the greatest height. The Academy issued a formal ban. Will Smith could not attend the Oscars for the next 10 years. He could not present. He could not be nominated. He was, in the most formal sense possible, excommunicated from the institution that had just crowned him Best Actor. for a man who had spent 54 years proving his worth through achievement, through awards, through the constant accumulation of public validation. This was not just a consequence. It was an obliteration of the primary mechanism through which he had justified his existence. The media consumed him. Think pieces proliferated. Half the world condemned him as a man who had revealed his true violent nature. The other half defended him as a man who had finally defended his wife's dignity. Both narratives missed the actual point. Will Smith was neither a monster finally exposed nor a hero finally unleashed. He was a man whose armor had cracked so completely that he could no longer hide what was underneath. Fear, anger, a desperate need to protect, a lifetime of buried trauma, finally erupting in public. But the world does not care about nuance when a famous man falls. The world cares about the fall itself. What followed was not redemption. It was something stranger and more honest: acceptance. In 2023, Will Smith released Big Willie Energy, a single that was not an apology and not a justification, simply a return to making music. The song was met with mixed reception. Some saw it as tone-deaf, others as a necessary reclamation of his voice. Neither response mattered as much as the act itself. He was no longer performing invincibility. He was simply existing as a man who had failed publicly and was choosing to continue anyway. Bad Boys, Ride or Die was released in 2024, 2 years after the Oscars incident. His co-star Martin Lawrence stood by him. The film was successful. It was not a redemption arc in narrative form. The film didn't address the slap or its consequences, but its existence itself was an act of reclamation. The world had not permanently destroyed Will Smith. The institutions had tried. They had partially succeeded. But the man himself, the actual person underneath the armor, was still standing. His relationship with Jada Pinkett Smith remained undefined. They were not divorced. They were not together in any conventional sense. They existed in a state of profound complication. Two people who had loved each other, who had hurt each other, who had been broken in public together, and who had decided to remain in each other's lives without pretending to be anything other than what they actually were. Imperfect people bound by history and children and a mutual understanding that perfection had never been real. In interviews, Will Smith began to speak differently about the slap. Not defensively, not apologetically, but with a kind of weary acceptance. The tone of a man who had finally stopped trying to control the narrative and had simply accepted that the narrative would always belong partially to the world, and that he could not reclaim it or rewrite it. He had done the thing. The world had reacted. Now he had to live inside that reality rather than trying to escape it. His relationship with his son Jaden, which had been strained for years. Jaden had publicly criticized his father's behavior, had pursued his own artistic path in deliberate opposition to his father's legacy, began to shift, not into easy reconciliation, but into genuine communication. Two men finally allowed to be themselves rather than performing the roles they thought their relationship required. At 58 years old, Will Smith is no longer the Fresh Prince. He is no longer untouchable. He is no longer invincible. He is, for the first time in his adult life, simply a man, flawed, visible, capable of failure, and somehow still standing. The armor that protected him for 54 years has cracked, and what lives inside is not the coward he feared. What lives inside is something far more human. A person capable of love and anger, of protection and violence, of profound regret and stubborn persistence. A person who spent decades proving he was not his father's son, only to discover that the proof itself was the prison. His career continues, but it is no longer the all-consuming architecture it once was. He makes films when the roles interest him. He makes music when he has something to say. He exists less as a brand and more as a human being who happens to be famous. A man learning, late in life, that this shift from performing to simply being is not a diminishment. It is a liberation. The 9-year-old boy who stood frozen while his father struck his mother finally learned, at 58, that movement does not require invincibility. It only requires willingness. At 58, Will Smith has become willing to be imperfect, visible, and still valuable. He has become willing to be broken and still standing. He has become willing to be a man rather than a persona. This is not a redemption story. This is a story about what happens when redemption becomes irrelevant. When a person stops trying to earn the right to exist and simply accepts that they do. The question is not whether Will Smith will ever fully recover from the Oscar slap. The question is, what does recovery even mean when the armor you spent your whole life building finally falls away, and you discover that you never needed it? What does redemption look like when you realize that the cowardice you spent 50 years running from was never the real problem? The real problem was believing that invincibility was something you had to earn. Will Smith is 58 years old. He has been famous for longer than most people have been alive. He has been performing perfection since before he understood what perfection actually was. And now, for the first time, he is simply living, imperfectly, publicly, without apology or explanation. The armor cracked, and underneath, there was just a man. There was just a person. There was just Will. I want to ask you something, and I genuinely want to hear your answer in the comments below. Think of a moment in your own life when you had to choose between the person you had built yourself to be and the person you actually are. What was that moment? And did you choose armor, or did you choose truth? Share it in the comments, not a generic reaction, but your own story.